look forward to the festive season, everyone should be able to enjoy a night out without having to worry about the safety of their drink and whether they will be able to get safely home.
Mr. Speaker, I met with constituents in Southall Green at my coffee morning on Friday, and they raised with me the constant issue of open drug dealing and antisocial behaviour in the town centre. Will the Secretary of State work with the Mayor of London to ensure we get more police onto the streets of London and the streets of Southall as soon as we possibly can?
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. We have already given the Met an additional £37 million this year on top of what they had been previously allocated, and we also need to make sure that here right across the country we have the neighbourhood police back in town centres, because that is how you tackle not just local drug dealing but also some of the antisocial behaviour and other crimes that blight communities.
Home Secretary Crisp.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, let me start by offering the Home Secretary a belated congratulations on her appointment. Having been a minister in that department, I know how difficult her job is, and I genuinely wish her well in doing it. We will always seek to work constructively with the government in the national interest. I also associate myself with the remarks she made about International Vorg Day. Mr. Speaker, since the election, 19,988 people have dangerously and illegally crossed the Channel, a 23% increase on the same period last year. Why does she think the numbers have gone up so much on her watch?
Well, I thank the Shadow Home Secretary for his opening words. I think he described his time in the Home Office as his best ministerial job ever, which, given that he was the Chief Secretary under Liz Truss, you can perhaps wonder why, Mr. Speaker. He was the Immigration Minister who, I might remind him, told the Commons and the Select Committee that he wouldn't rule out using giant wave machines as the way to stop small boat crossings. Mr. Speaker, we inherited record high levels of small boat crossings in the first half of this year. We have taken action to fix their chaos.
I'm asking the Home Secretary about her record. I'm asking the Home Secretary about why small boat crossings have gone up during her time in office. Perhaps it's because, as the National Crime Agency said, we need a deterrent. Yet she cancelled the Rwanda deterrent before it even started. And now we hear Ursula von der Leyen, the European Commission President, asking European member states to look at offshore processing. Isn't that the reason why it's gone up? And isn't that the reason why the Immigration Minister sat over there is admitted last week she is opening up new hotels instead of closing them down?
Well, Mr. Speaker, seriously, what a lot of chaos. Highest level on record was the last 6 months of the last Conservative government while he was in government, and in fact the numbers since the summer are not the highest on record. That unfortunately was his legacy, and while he was the Immigration Minister, he increased the number of asylum hotels 500% and increased the number of people in asylum hotels by over 900%. So seriously, he should not try and give lectures to anybody else at all.
Well, I'm going to do a little lecture. If you really want this attack on each other, can you do it before we get to topicals? They're meant to be short and sweet because other members won't get in. And Lee Smidsley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Specialist domestic abuse services like the First Step in Knowsley are facing an increase in demand, but are having to turn people away due to a lack of funding. Can the Minister tell me what more they can do to support services like this?
I thank the honourable lady, and to say that I have visited First Steps, and to say that it is run by brilliant Merseyside women would be an underestimation. Specialist buy and force services are an essential part of this and provide tailored support to victims and survivors. We understand that challenges that the sector faces, particularly with the level of demand that their services are currently facing. All decisions on funding after March 2025 are subject to the spending review process.
Democrat spokesperson Luke Taylor.
Thank you. We all want to stop criminals from terrorising our communities, whether they're domestic abusers or shoplifters targeting our high streets. Live facial recognition is being rolled out by our police forces, including on Sutton High Street in my constituency, but we cannot ignore the risks this technology presents. Facial recognition systems are most likely to misidentify black people and women, doing nothing to stop crime and further eroding trust in our police. Will the Minister introduce clear regulation and oversight of live facial recognition like the EU passed last April?
Well, this is another area where this new incoming Labour government is having to look at powers or things that were brought in by the previous government. Now, live facial recognition can have very positive effects, but we do need to look at whether we need a framework around it. That's why I'll be hosting a series of roundtables before Christmas to discuss with stakeholders the way forward on this technology.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The National Audit Office recently raised serious concerns about the previous government's decision to buy poor quality, expensive and contaminated asylum accommodation at North Eye. What steps is the department taking to ensure that asylum accommodation is fit for purpose and value for money?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend is absolutely right to raise this issue. What was found by the National Audit Office in their report was not just an appalling process of decision-making by members of the previous government, but a grotesque waste of £15 million of taxpayers' money, just like the waste of £60 million at RAF Scampton. In contrast, the new government is determined to cut asylum accommodation costs by stepping up decision-making, reducing the backlog, and increasing returns.
So backbenchers who don't get in.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Transnational repression by Iran, China, unfriendly nations continues writ large on diaspora populations in this country. So what is the government's strategy on transnational repression, and will she reintroduce the last government's Defending Democracy Task Force to monitor incidents?
It's a good point. The Democracy Task Force is working very closely to look at the threats that the Honourable Gentleman has raised, and we'll have more to say about it shortly.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the Home Secretary would agree with me that good government is transparent government. I've been told by her department in response to a written question that the number of crimes committed by illegal migrants is not available through published statistics. I'm sure that the Home Office does hold the data, so would the Minister today commit to publishing that information in full?
Here.
Mr. Speaker, there's a huge statistical drop of immigration-related national statistics coming at the end of this week.
Jake Richards.
Mr. Speaker, two brave women from Maltby came to my most recent surgery. Each told me about horrific physical and emotional abuse they had suffered at the hands of their ex-partners. In their case, non-molestation orders had been, they told me, ignored by the police, and this, from my professional experience prior to coming to the bar, is far from uncommon. What steps will the government take to ensure any relevant court orders are given due force?
The honourable member makes a very important point, and there is a serious problem about injunctions, non-molestation orders and protection orders not being treated properly. That is why we're introducing Raneem's law, including stronger protection orders and specialists in 999 control rooms.
Chelmsford's allocation of dispersal accommodation for asylum seekers is for over 120 beds, but the number found to date is around 1/10 of this due to the high demand and cost of private rented accommodation in the district. What extra support can the Minister offer to councils facing the increasing cost of housing asylum seekers?
Mr. Speaker, we are trying to cooperate much more with local authorities so that we can deal with the issues here. But in the end, the way to deal with this is to get the backlog down, get people out of high price accommodation so that we can integrate them if they're granted asylum.
Mohammed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have met with a number of British Palestinian families who are trying to reunite with their families in Gaza. Part of the entry clearance process requires biometrics to be undertaken. There is no visa centre in Gaza and they are unable to leave due to the closure of the Rafah crossing. Will the Home Secretary or the Minister please indicate whether they are willing to waive temporary biometrics so that people can undertake the entry clearance process?
I thank my honourable friend for her question. The death and destruction in Gaza is intolerable, and indeed Palestinians who wish to join family members in the UK must do so via the range of existing routes that are available. If she has a specific matter that she wishes to raise with me, I'd be very happy to meet her about it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can the Minister tell this House what steps she is taking to tackle crime in rural areas, please?
As I said earlier in one of my answers, I've met with the Agricultural Equipment Association to discuss the implementation of the secondary legislation that's required around theft of agricultural equipment. And I've also having meetings with the rural crime units to discuss some of the specifics, but the neighbourhood policing guarantee applies in rural areas just as much as in urban areas, which is important.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent Tracy has set up the organisation Changes Are Made in memory of her grandson, Cameron Hamilton, who was fatally stabbed in Bournemouth Town Centre last year. Tracy believes deeply in the power of education and positive activities to tackle knife crime and is campaigning for a youth hub in our constituency. Can the Home Secretary update us on the progress made to rolling out a network of youth hubs, and will she support Tracy's campaign?
Can I pay tribute to her constituent Tracy for the campaigning and also in memory of Cameron. Too many young lives are being lost. That is why we are setting up the Young Futures programme with youth hubs, but also prevention partnerships to work across the country.
Julie Lopez.
Mr. Speaker, in recent weeks, channel crossings have been far higher than the Home Office expected, and that's why we've seen ministers rapidly approving new asylum hotels. We're told this situation is temporary because asylum claims are apparently now being processed faster, moving people through accommodation faster too. What reassurances can the Minister give my constituents that the faster processing of asylum claims with no deterrent in the system will not simply act as a massive incentive for more people to come here on small boats?
I have to tell the honourable member that unfortunately before the last election the previous government cut asylum decision-making by 75% in the run-up to the election, took away caseworkers, and that is why the backlog was soaring. We have now put caseworkers back into place so that we can start clearing the backlog, because the asylum hotels are costing the taxpayer huge amounts of money.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Disabled women are almost 3 times more likely to experience domestic abuse and almost twice as likely to report sexual violence. So does my honourable friend, the Home Secretary, agree with me that it's not only important that her department but also the police work with disabled women-led organisations to understand how this intersects with gender-based violence and the double whammy that affects disabled women?
The honourable lady is absolutely right. And I pay tribute to Stay Safe East, for example, one of very few specialist disability and domestic abuse charities. But without buy-in for services, we simply would not be serving most of the women in our country who need support.
Final question, Peter Bamford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A report today shows that 60,000 hours are taken up each year investigating non-crime hate incidents. Does the Minister agree with me that confidence in the police could be restored if they prioritise their time and resources to investigating actual crime than hurt feelings?
This government has made very clear what our priorities are around safer streets, and where the focus should be for policing around halving knife crime, halving violence against women and girls over the next decade. The Home Secretary has also been very clear that a common sense approach must be taken with non-hate crime incidents, and we will work with the Inspectorate and the College of Policing on this matter.
Right, that completes questions. Call the Prime Minister. I should like to say a few words about our former colleague Lord Prescott. John was first elected to this House in 1970 and served the people of Hull for 4 decades. He became Deputy Leader of the Labour Party in 1994, in which my father also helped on that campaign, and Deputy Prime Minister at the 1997 election. And I've got to say thanks to John for coming to Chorley, to ensuring a new start as a Labour member in Chorley. And I'll just share what John did. On that day, tragically, the press were pushing an old lady over. Her arm was broken, and the first thing John said, "I must go to that hospital," and he went to the hospital to see that lady as her cast was being put on. That was the kind of person that John Prescott was. He played a major role in delivering the Kyoto Protocol and was a great champion for regional government, integrated transport and affordable housing. After leaving government, he became an active interparliamentary relations, leading the UK delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. He was an effective politician, highly respected colleague and a towering figure in the Labour movement and in this House. He will be deeply missed, and all our thoughts are with Pauline and the family. I now call the Prime Minister on a point of order. Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for those words which John's family will have heard. There are many members of this House who serve their constituents faithfully. Some deliver change for the entire country. Very few enter into public consciousness, let alone public affection. But John Prescott achieved all of those things. He was absolutely unique, and people loved him for it. He had the most extraordinary life, from failing his 11+, to stewarding Anthony Eden on a cruise ship, to being deputy leader of, as he described it, the greatest party that there is. And the longest-serving deputy prime minister this country has ever had. An extraordinary life, Mr. Speaker. And yet, ordinary people across the nation felt that he was one of them. He told a story of working-class lad made good, who embodied the aspiration of working people across the entire country. People felt recognised in the struggles they have, the snobbery, the small-mindedness that still plagues politics even today. But also they felt that he understood and championed their ambitions, their hopes and their dreams. He was a politician for working people through and through. That was who he always was, a proud son of Wales and also an honorary son of the Humber. He served the city of Hull for 40 years, as you said, Mr. Speaker, and everyone knew that he loved it as fiercely as he fought for it. Everything he did was about making working people's lives better, and that was evident from his whole career. A career where he was often ahead of his time, Mr. Speaker. He led, as you said, on climate change, fighting regional inequality, supporting the minimum wage, working to transform public transport, building council houses, and even completing the Channel Tunnel. In many ways, he set the path that we walk today. Because, make no mistake, Mr. Speaker, he did things his own way and forged his own path. And in doing so, he brought about some of the greatest transformation this country has ever seen. The linchpin of New Labour. Because beneath the pugnacious exterior, John was a skilled negotiator, sometimes with immense and perhaps surprising sensitivity. He had an incredible skill, which was the ability to bring people together from different starting points, whether that was his work on climate negotiations or closer at home in his own party, to stand together in a better place. And that sums up another thing that the public, I think, sensed about John. He was not in it for himself. He was willing to work with people that he didn't agree with, as well as challenge those that he usually did agree with. He had great self-awareness, great humility, and if he disagreed fiercely in private, he would do so. And then he would defend the line, often improved because of his intervention, in public to the hilt. He was a team player, and he was proud to play for Team Labour. And, Mr. Speaker, that was never more evident than during the campaign season, when it was time to bring out the battle bus, which has become a tradition our Deputy Prime Minister proudly continued this year. because the Prescott Express was a morale boost to any campaign. It may have been arriving in a Tesco car park, but John was always met with a reception like Beatlemania. And no wonder, Mr. Speaker, the public were at the heart of John's politics. And it's clear the public had a particular place in their heart for him too. And that was key to his popularity. And indeed, after the famous incident, it was the public who came out swinging for him. Because that night, as you can imagine, Labour campaigners were anxiously dispatched to the most accurate focus group that there is, the local pub, to hear what people were saying. And reports, Mr. Speaker, were clear. The public had his back, just as he'd always had theirs. And so Tony Blair, my predecessor, said simply then, John is John. And he was, Mr. Speaker. John was John. And he will live on in Labour legend and in the memory, I think, of everybody in this House now and who's served when he's been in the House, and in the affection of the nation. We remember today his wife, Pauline, and we send our love and condolences to his family and his loved ones. We stand with the people of Hull, the working people across the country, to say thank you, John, for a lifetime of service, for a genuine character, for a changed nation, and, Mr. Speaker, may he rest in peace. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Leader of the Opposition, Kemi Badenoch.
Mr. Speaker, may I, on behalf of the Opposition, put on record tributes from this side of the House to the late John Prescott. Lord Prescott will be remembered for many things. As a committed member of Parliament for his beloved constituency of Kingston upon Hull East, as a formidable campaigner for causes he believed in, and for his public service as Deputy Prime Minister. As I said last week, he was a true patriot and had a unique way of connecting with the electorate. Many of us did not know him personally, but his strength of personality was felt. For those of us who came into politics during the New Labour era, our experience of politics was shaped by Lord Prescott. He was a leading figure in making the Labour Party under Tony Blair electable after enduring 4 consecutive election defeats. In the process of broadening his party's appeal, he was someone who ensured that Labour thought about the needs, values and aspirations of regular people across this country, not just those of a metropolitan elite. He was often underestimated, yet by all accounts, he was an intelligent, amusing and relentlessly hard-working man with great political instincts. While I would doubtless have disagreed with him on many things, I would have loved the opportunity to argue with him about making our country better. So in paying tribute to the late Lord Prescott, I express my heartfelt condolences on my behalf and of my party, and I send sincere condolences to his family, his friends and his colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Culture.
Further to those points of order, Mr. Speaker, I rise today not just to pay tribute to my predecessor as the Member of Parliament for East Hull, but also as a family friend for over 50 years. In doing so, I send my heartfelt condolences to Pauline and the family. Many will remember John as a political giant, and indeed he was, but he was also a gentle giant to many. John always had time to chat to anybody who stopped him. Many members today will speak of the great work John did in both this House and outside of it. But I want to speak today about the John we knew in East Hull, both as our MP and, as he was to many, a very dear friend. East Hull was John's adoptive home, and it became such a strong part of his own identity. Everyone in East Hull has their own story of John, those that he helped, and there were many thousands of them. One of John's biggest legacies in Hull was the 55 million regeneration of Preston Road Estate in the heart of the constituency as part of the New Deal for Communities. And I'm told that John was the person in the Cabinet who spearheaded that particular programme. But, Mr. Speaker, I had the great pleasure and honour of knowing John all of my life. As kids, we enjoyed family holidays with the Prescotts. And I still keep a picture of me, JP, and the family hurtling down the log flume on my desk in my office. I keep it, Mr. Speaker, for a reason. John's clearly the person who's enjoying that the most. But one year, John decided we were going to go to Loch Ness to find Nessie. We didn't find Nessie, but we had the most amazing time with memories we'll never forget. During the voyage, Captain John thought it'd be fun to throw his watch overboard to test our diving skills. As kids, we didn't realise that John was an expert diver. But as it sank too far, we began to panic a bit. But John, with a big grin on his face, dived overboard, missing for, we thought, more than a few minutes, to put it mildly. But then he came up the other side of the vessel, holding the watch with a massive grin on his face. John's legacy will always be etched in the hearts of those he served and the city that he loved. There'll never be another JP, and no member of this House will ever be able to connect with the voters quite like JP did. He truly was one of a kind. John's spirit and approach to politics will live on in all of us who were inspired by him, inspired by his dedication and commitment to the cause. Rest in peace, comrade.
Yeah. Sure, David, leader of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was never on John Prescott's Christmas card list, but I did have the interesting task of shadowing him in the early noughties for 3 years, and I felt like I got to know him. My respect for him grew, though I was never sure if this was entirely reciprocated. I would occasionally tour the media studios with him, and on one occasion John was getting his makeup on and clearly hadn't realised I was outside the door, and he said to his aide, "Is that bloody Liberal here again?" We spoke more in later years when I was Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, as John always retained a deep and well-informed interest in all things climate, with his significant globally recognised role in securing the Kyoto Climate Treaty. The government's chief climate negotiator in my time, the brilliant but sadly departed Pete Betts, had also been John's key negotiator at Kyoto. Pete would tell the story of how John's sheer energy and staying power were crucial to the success of those negotiations, and how John would tour the negotiating rooms throughout the night, uttering the great phrase, "I'm walking, I'm talking." Our paths also crossed in the great city of Kingston upon Hull, when we eventually managed to get Siemens to invest in a wind turbine manufacturing facility for offshore wind farms. There was a celebration on the day when the first sod was turned to build the factory, and the reception was held in what is called the Deep, a huge tourist attraction which John had played a crucial role in making happen down by the marina in Hull. The Deep is the UK's home to several species of shark. As we walked around it, being instructed about sharks, we were reliably informed that sharks can be very friendly. And though he'd never admit it in public, John was always very friendly to me. He was a trailblazer and an inspiration, even plunging into the Thames in a wetsuit to make an important point about water pollution. Exactly the sort of savvy, effective campaigning I, for one, admire. John will be missed by very many people, and so on behalf of bloody Liberals everywhere, I send my heartfelt condolences to Pauline, to John's children and grandchildren, and to all of his family and many friends.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And further to that point of order, as Chair of the Parliamentary Labour Party, can I also echo the tribute made by the Prime Minister and send our thoughts and our love to John's family. And at the PLP tonight, we'll have our chance to reflect on the enormous contribution to the country and the party. And as a former Labour organiser, I can tell you he was beloved by our members. They would move mountains in Wales to go and see him. And although he himself said, when I do die, after 50 years in politics, all that they will show on the news is the 60 seconds of me thumping a fellow in Wales, I think the many, many tributes over the weekend rightly reflected his immense contribution to the country, which should never ever be underestimated. His drive to improve council housing, his championing of minimum wage, his leadership on climate change, climate action, before it was a thing. A true socialist and thoroughly authentic. He only cared about making people's lives better. But back to that punch. There are many others here today who were close friends with John, who worked with him and knew him far, far better than me. We were, however, connected by one event. For I, as the youngest General Secretary of the Welsh Labour Party, organised his visit to Rhyl. Clearly not very well, although he never seemed to hold it against me, and he didn't get me sacked, which was an enormous relief at the time. There is so much I could say about that day. He was a trooper. He went back inside immediately after the punch and did this rather strange comedy show at the Little Theatre. But I won't test your patience, Mr Speaker. The definitive guide is there in Matt Ford's podcast with Martin Angus, which I would recommend you all listen to. However, for those of us there in the background in the footage, it just never goes away. And although he was right, that clip has been shown 1 million times again over the weekend. His legacy was always far, far bigger than a GIF. He will be much missed by our big Labour family.
By the House, Sir Edward Lee.
I served for many years in this place with John Prescott, and of course I admired him from afar as a true Labour man, a man of true grit. I'm not sure that my admiration of him was reciprocated, but we did hold him in great affection. My first memory of him was when I arrived in this place as a new Member of Parliament in 1983, and I gave a speech, and John was sitting down here, and I could see him grunting, obviously furious. He probably thought I was just an absurd young Thatcherite opinionated brat, and he was probably right. And talking of Mrs Thatcher, my next memory of him was I went down to the little members' canteen, which we used to have downstairs, the members' canteen, and John was there having a quiet supper, and Mrs Thatcher came in. And I always remember this, that the moment my boss, Mrs Thatcher, came in, I could see John waving his hands with fury at her of all that she had done. And Neil Kinnock leant over and said, "Calm down, John, calm down, John." I just thought that here's a man of, real strong opinion, and we have so many anemic politicians around today. How wonderful it was. I'm not, of course, looking at anybody, of course. How wonderful it was to have a man like John Prescott on the other side of the chamber. Of course, he much mellowed, and it was a great joy to serve with him on the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And he did mellow, and I remember him saying that his children wanted him to go on Celebrity Come Dancing, but he decided not to. But that would have been something for the history books, John Prescott on Celebrity Come Dancing. So, really, I just want to end by saying that as a local Member of Parliament, I want to pay tribute to him. And I do take my children, or I did take my children to the deep, and all those things he did for Hull. And I wish some of you could have watched Hull North, which is our sort of small local television programme last week, to see the tributes and what people were saying, local people, about how much he was so much loved in Hull and worked so hard for the people. A great man, and he will be sorely missed.
Steve Young.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I was also deeply saddened to hear of the death of John Prescott, and my condolences also to Pauline and his sons and all who were close to him. I considered him to be a good friend of mine, and to Mansfield, he was a giant of a man and a champion of the coalfields, devolution, local government and, of course, climate action. I first met John in the 1980s as an activist in the Labour Party and enjoyed supporting him both for his first campaign to be Deputy Leader in 1988, and again for Leader and Deputy Leader in 1994. His legacy includes setting up the Coalfield Regeneration Trust, which was established to help support former coalfield areas and communities like Mansfield impacted by the pit closure programmes of the 1980s and 90s. This helped ensure that my area received millions of pounds of funding. John has a particularly strong link to my constituency of Mansfield, and particularly with my Labour predecessor, Sir Alan Meale, who was his parliamentary private secretary for some years. And anecdotally, I can recall many endearing memories of John, including a time when we were both playing table tennis in Sir Alan's front yard in Mansfield. A lovely sunny day, and we were enjoying our game in the garden on a day when the Prime Minister was out of the country on business. And an important call came through, which he had to take, and we paused our game. To this day, I have no idea who it was or what was said, but the conversation clearly distracted John, so much so that when he arrived back, he hit the ball with such force that it bounced right off the table and hit the ministerial car. And Mr. Speaker, from that experience, I can assure the House that the left hook still packed a mighty punch. In the years after John had left office, and after many visits to Mansfield, I would often drive him back to Newark or Doncaster station so he could get the train to London or back home to Hull. And Mr. Speaker, the insights from this frank and honest recollections of history from the Blair and Brown years will stay with me for a very long time. May you rest in peace.
Yes. Sir David Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When I first arrived in the House, it was common amongst the Conservative Party, the Thatcherite Conservative Party, I say to my pallid friend, to view John Prescott as public enemy number one. And it was an act he loved playing into, in public at least. But that being said, he was, certainly to me, when he's outside the studio and outside the chamber, friendly, helpful, indeed almost the best possible constituency neighbour you could want. But he was also quintessentially a working class hero, something I suspect the current Deputy Prime Minister adopts as well. And of course he was a brilliant and good constituency ally and a forceful defender of the interests of the people of Hull, with the emphasis on force. However, he was also a necessary champion of the new Labour Party. The Prime Minister referred to the fact that, implicitly, that he delivered one man, one vote. And I think we should remember that that was an act of huge courage for him to take on his own union allies, I think at about 1 hour's notice, and persuade them to support the new neophyte Tony Blair. And frankly, despite the snobbery of the London establishment about his education and so on, it was a very, very unwise person who underestimated the intellect of John Prescott. He was a formidable innovator, you know, on looking at the Environment Secretary, on environment, on Europe, on devolution, on a whole range of things. He was a brilliant innovator. He was what we had all hoped to be, not a creature of history, but a changer of history. And for that, we should always admire him. And as well, to put to one side all of those grand things, he also was greatly, greatly loved by his family. And on that basis, I offer my condolences to Pauline and the rest of the family.
Yeah. Andy Michael.
Mr. Speaker, I'd just like to add my own few words to the tributes made, and especially welcome the comments of my honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull. They were so clearly warm and personal. I just simply wanted to add that John Prescott's many achievements have already been told in terms of commitments to climate change and other matters. A truly authentic working class hero, somebody who would always attract a crowd wherever he went when he's on his famous battle bus, and he persevered with that through good times and in poorer times. But I think what sometimes may be missed is his commitment to devolution and the great efforts he made, certainly in the northeast of England, committing to the campaign for a North-Eastern Assembly. We were not successful on that occasion. The referendum was not won, but ultimately John's legacy prevails by the institutions, the devolved authorities that we've seen ever since. And on a personal note, Mr. Speaker, I just also want to put on the record my thanks to him for his personal support to me. I found myself propelled onto the shadow front bench a little bit prematurely and unexpectedly, but he was of great support to me in discharging the transport brief, and such immense knowledge that he retained, and at every single occasion he would offer that encouragement, for which I'll be eternally grateful. He was a true giant of the Labour movement. We will miss him enormously, but his legacy remains on, and I too would like to pass my sincere condolences to Pauline and to all of his family. Thank you.
Pete Wishart.
Mr. Speaker, on behalf of the Scottish National Party, could we pass on our most sincerest condolences to Pauline, John's family, and to his many friends, colleagues and comrades right across the Labour movement. You have lost a colossus of a man and an inspiration to working class people right across the United Kingdom who were inspired to come into politics because of the example that John Prescott showed. I remember coming down here as a new MP in 2001, Mr. Speaker, and you would observe the Labour front bench titans, all of them, all known to the UK public, but predominant amongst all of them was John Prescott, and it was John Prescott the public wanted to hear from. When he appeared on the TV screens, that was when the public paid attention and listened to what he had to say. And there was this curious affection and resonance that he had with the British public that means something that if we could bottle it, I'm sure we'd all take a little bit of that and a sup of that today. And I'll never forget as a candidate in 2001, and who could? I think we all knew where we were in 2001 as a candidate when that famous incident came in that the member for Newport East has referenced. I was with a bunch of sixth formers at Brecon High School at Hustings, and I remember one of the senior people saying to me, if it was like that every day in your political life, I want a bit of that. So there's inspiration for you, Mr. Speaker. He was a huge music fan too, and I remember he was a great supporter of our music act in MP4. We could never quite master the jazz that he seemed to favour, though maybe as tribute to him we'll maybe get round to do one of these numbers, but it was something that he completely loved. And everybody's talked about his commitment to climate change, but it was also his commitment to devolution. A few colleagues have mentioned that. And I think it was John Prescott that was the engine that drove that path towards a Scottish Parliament and, of course, the regional assemblies, which will be happening as a matter of course with this new Labour government. He was a part of a generation, Mr. Speaker, that we are now sadly beginning to lose. But he will stand out as one of the true great parliamentarians in this House of the past few decades, and we will all miss him dearly.
John Pearce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's so wonderful to hear all of the various tributes to John, and I just wanted to share my own memories of him. As some people have already mentioned, when it comes to campaigning, his big thing was his battle bus. And who wouldn't love touring the country, eating sweets with Martin Angus? And I'm sure the Right Honourable Member for Ashton-under-Lyne will attest to that. I have my own memory of John's battle bus, which is after the 2005 election. He got a small group of us together, and we toured London as commuters were on their way to work at 7:30, 8 o'clock in the morning, with John on the tannoy, thanking them all individually for voting Labour and for another 5 years of a Labour government. Watching people literally stop in the street, confused by why a bus was talking to them, only to discover that it was actually the Deputy Prime Minister that was talking to them, was incredible. He then took us all to his flat, where, having had no sleep at all, he made us bacon sandwiches and tea. This was John at his best, generous, indomitable, and completely unpredictable. His incredible achievements and those of that Labour government will stand the test of time. He was the cement that kept that broad church of those new Labour governments together. And we will always remember him for that. And I just want to say, last year my father died of Alzheimer's. And it's very difficult in those early days to actually remember the man who was before that cruel disease took them away. I really do hope that Pauline and his family are listening to the wonderful tributes that are being paid here in this house and around the country, and so that they can remember the extraordinary man and the extraordinary life that John was and lived. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Sir Bernard.
Speaker, further to the point of order, I first collided, if that's the right word, with John Prescott when I was Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, as he ploughed on with his integrated transport plan, which was one of the centrepieces of the first Blair administration. I found that some of my colleagues very easily tried to treat John Prescott as a bit of a joke. That was a mistake. Yes, we teased him about his 2 Jags, and he rather loved that. But he was utterly sincere in what he did, and passionate and pretty brutal with his opposition opponents when he felt he was on top. We clashed again over the proposals for regional assemblies, and great campaigner that he was, he lost the North East referendum, and I don't think he ever really forgave me for that. But when required, he could be a great statesman. He was right to insist on a public inquiry into the Marchioness disaster, which the previous government had refused to hold. And he was right immediately to announce an inquiry into the Paddington rail disaster as soon as it had happened. And I recall getting the most surprising telephone call, one of the most surprising telephone calls of my political life, having told the conference, the Conservative conference, he was right to call that public inquiry and we should wait for its outcome. I got a call from him to thank me for that bit of bipartisanship, which even he was capable of when the cameras weren't looking. And I do pay tribute to him for this, because the Cullen inquiry came up with a completely new safety regime for rail, including a rail accident investigation branch for the Department of Transport. We've never had a public inquiry into a rail accident ever since, because of the safety regime that he implemented following the inquiry. And every survivor of the Paddington rail crash and subsequent rail crashes is grateful to him for what he did for passenger safety on our railways, and we should remember him, if for nothing else, for that. And I send my best wishes to his family and to all his friends and colleagues on the other side of the House at this sad time.
Yeah. Julian Bims.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have 2 particular memories of Lord Prescott that I would like to share. The first is from my time working for the disability charity Scope. We had decided as a campaigns team to use the 1997 general election to highlight the many obstacles that disabled people face when exercising their democratic right to vote. I and my campaign colleagues devised the Polls Apart campaign, which included a special campaign pack for candidates. Now, bearing in mind this is in the halcyon days before email, a campaign pack was something of a rarity. And so we printed, stapled and posted out hundreds of packs to candidates the length and breadth of the UK, including one to the Labour candidate for Kingston upon Hull. Off it went, second class, and to our amazement, a week or so later, a reply came back, saying not only did Mr Prescott support the campaign, but that he had written to all of Labour's candidates in his capacity as the General Election Coordinator, instructing them to take the campaign actions our pack suggested. And then more than that, when Labour was elected a few weeks later, he brought forward an amended Representation of the People's Act to make it easier for disabled people to exercise their right to vote.
I had met John Prescott a few years earlier when I worked for the then Member of Parliament for Streatham, the Right Honourable Keith Hill. Both John and Keith were members of the RMT parliamentary group, a group that was as broad and diverse as its talent was deep. I asked Keith ahead of my remarks today if he had any particular memories of John that I might share with the House, and he told me of one from his time as Minister in the Office for the Deputy Prime Minister. John and Keith were due to make a presentation on Labour's housing growth areas to the Prime Minister, Tony Blair, in the Cabinet Room one morning at 9 a.m. At 4 a.m, John was still working on the presentation and decided that he needed to know about the rail connections between Cambridge and Oxford. So he phoned Network Rail. Members can doubtless imagine the startled reaction of the poor Network Rail official who answered that call at 4 o'clock in the morning from someone claiming to be the Deputy Prime Minister and who had a very specific question about east-west rail links. Tony Blair was equally amazed at 9 a.m. that morning. "And did he tell you what the rail connections are?" asked the PM. "There aren't any," replied John. "We're going to change that." And now, thanks to the budget, that change will finally be delivered. A fitting tribute, perhaps, to the work ethic, energy and enthusiasm for change that John Prescott exemplified.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Mr. Speaker, and my condolences to Pauline and all of John's family at what must be a truly devastating time for them. David sent me a message just after John had died, and David used to work in my office, and he was very close to his father, who saw him as his hero and his friend, and I think we send our condolences to all of them. I obviously knew John in the House for many years, and when he was first elected, along with Dennis Skinner, they shared a flat in Clapham. I don't know what went on in that flat in Clapham, but they were, whilst they were good friends, they were also very different characters. And I later learnt that after the last vote ever took place in the House, Dennis and John would both leave to go back to the flat, but never travel together, because Dennis always made sure he got there first, so he could get hold of the one television in the flat and turn on and watch the darts or the snooker, whatever else. John would turn up and want to watch Newsnight. Dennis refused to change the channel. Said, "No way, you watch the darts with me." And you could sort of imagine the repartee and the arguments that were going on between them, which would have been incredibly funny. In the 2017 election, John offered to help in any way he could, and he was fantastic, and we had several events we did together. One day we were started in Hull in the morning with a launch of our Arts Manifesto, and then went on a tour all around Yorkshire and Humberside in the famous bus. John seemed to know the owner of every fish and chip shop in the whole of Yorkshire and insisted on stopping at every fish and chip shop in Yorkshire, so we had a big supply of fish and chips all day long. And then we got to Scarborough, where we were doing a rally there in the pavilion by the seafront, and John and I got up to speak on the stage, and a lot of the people there, I don't think they really realised it was a political rally going on. They thought they were just there enjoying the sunshine. Then these two guys get up on the stage and start talking. Then they loved John because he brought out Freddie the Fox, and we had a long discussion about the evils of fox hunting, the evils of Tory fox hunting, the Tories that were always going to bring back fox hunting, the Tories who would kill the fox. Then he pulled Freddie out of his coat and said, "Look at poor Freddie here. They're going to tear him apart. That's what the Tories do to you." And he was loved for all of that. I want to say thank you to John for what he did, but also just remember one of the crucial points in his political career was the issues of climate change and Kyoto. It wasn't easy, it wasn't popular, it wasn't normal. A lot of people refused to even consider the issues of what we are doing to the natural world and the environment, and how there are limits to what you can do, and hence the protocol that he negotiated and signed up. And I think he was one of the very important people to start to change the global debate about climate change and respect for the natural world and the environment. And I think we should all say thank you to John Prescott for that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The first time I met John Prescott in his role as Deputy Prime Minister was in 1997 when he opened up Admiralty Arch to 60 young homeless people for part of the winter shelter programme at the time, and it was a bitterly cold winter. And at the time, a Conservative backbencher, Crispin Blunt, said that this project would be treating an historic building as if it were a flagship for undesirables. Well, given that John was frequently described as undesirable by many of his opponents in his life, he took that as a badge of honour. And he was really, really proud of that homelessness project. I'll never forget the way he shared breakfast with those rough sleepers and took a real interest in every one of their lives. It was a testimony to his compassion, his practical politics, and also to his unwavering commitment to housing policy. Many millions of council tenants had home improvements with new windows, new doors and home insulation, and none of them will ever forget that. They're all the basics that many of us take for granted, but which far too many people lacked at the time. In a superb biography by my former late colleague on The Independent, Colin Brown, naturally titled Fighting Talk, there was a lovely quote and a telling quote from John, and it was this: "There are those priests on the left who want to keep their consciences, and there are those who will get their hands dirty. I belong to the Dirty Hands Brigade." So John was regularly patronised, he was frequently underestimated, but he had the last laugh with delivery for real working people. For that, we'll all be grateful.
Nigel Farage.
Thank you. In the last 6 months of 2005, the United Kingdom took over the rotating presidency of the European Union, and Prime Minister Blair wanted to make a big success of it. One of their concerns is that there was a young British MEP who was prone to behaving very badly in the chamber and being particularly rude to visiting heads of state. And so John Prescott was sent to see me. He himself, of course, had served as an MEP and was a big project supporter, loved everything about the European Union. So he came to explain to me that it would be very bad for Britain if I was to stand up and cause a scene when Prime Minister Blair was speaking. I won't say that he threatened me, but I certainly felt deeply intimidated and behaved myself impeccably over the course of the next 6 months. That was perhaps the bruiser John Prescott, but then a couple of years later, it was Remembrance Sunday, and the ceremony was over, the parades had finished, and I was walking up Whitehall, and then to my astonishment, walking on his own, without any security, was the Deputy Prime Minister. And I said hello, and I wondered what he was doing, and he'd seen a group on the other side of Whitehall of Arctic convoy veterans. And of course, John, a seafarer himself, went over, spoke to the men who'd endured such appalling hardship in the last couple of years of the war, and said to them, "I'm going to fight and make sure that you guys get a campaign medal after all these years, recognising what you've done." Well, they did get the medal, and I got the message, and I understood why he'd been so phenomenally successful from humble roots. He just connected, he got on with people, he was very, very human. So we mourn his passing, but perhaps also we mourn the passing of big working class characters in politics. We need far more of them.
Bill Esterson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. John had many connections with the northwest of England, as you well know. He went to school on the Wirral. He was a parliamentary candidate in Southport and returned there to campaign in that 2017 general election. And of course, he was a seafarer out of Liverpool, and he was presented with a trophy by Anthony Eden, who the Prime Minister mentioned earlier. The trophy was for winning a boxing bout on board the ship, and it was there that he honed his craft that maybe led to what we know him for so famously later on. And when I came in here in 2010, I bumped into him in the committee corridor. He was sitting at a desk working, and he said he was there because despite being the former Deputy Prime Minister, he was having to share an office with 4 other members of the House of Lords, as he'd recently been ennobled, and moaned about the fact there was no preferential treatment for him. But in spite of the moan, he was getting on with the job as John always did. But my favourite story of him is in that 2010 election campaign. The battle bus turned up on Grand National Day outside Aintree Racecourse, and he had a campaign to keep the Grand National free to air on terrestrial TV. And there he was with his speakers, his loudspeakers, haranguing the racegoers to come and sign his petition, which they did in their droves. And not only did they sign the petition, they then queued in large numbers for selfies with John, because it goes to this point about the affection in which he was held. And it will stay with me forever just what an impression John had that day. And when I came in here and was serving in this place as he was serving in the Lords, he was a source of terrific advice to me, and I'm proud to have counted John as a friend over the years. I wish my best to Pauline, to David and to the rest of his family. May John rest in peace.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Further to the point of order, when I was elected to Beverley and Holderness in 2005, John Prescott was, of course, already a legend and the MP for neighbouring East Hull. And he was, of course, the word-mangling, fast-fisted former bar steward who had, for the last 8 years, been Deputy Prime Minister of this United Kingdom. And hearing the tributes from across the House today, hearing all the ways that that one man was able to influence history and make a difference is an inspiration, I think, hopefully to working-class aspirant politicians all over the country, but also to people in this House as well. But I knew him a few years before I entered Parliament, because he came to Cambridge for a transport summit. So I organised a demonstration against this happening and stood there outside all day. And more, of course, as the day went on, he didn't come out. So eventually, when he did come out, I was just about the only demonstrator left. So I immediately berated him and his entourage, and we then had a surreal dance around the car park before he went straight up to this Jaguar and tried to get in. It wasn't his. I think it took quite some time for him to forgive me for that. I would see John regularly, as do colleagues from Hull, such as the member for Hull North, who's sitting on the front bench opposite, on Hull trains, normally surrounded by papers and at a four-place table, trying to keep it entirely to himself. Though he was gruff, he was also engaging, and he would often come to Beverley. So Pauline would go shopping in the shops of Beverley, and he would come to the Royal Standard, which is the finest pub and establishment in Beverley, and where he was always very welcome, and where members to this day hold him in the highest regard. As has been remarked, he led our delegation to the COP at Kyoto in 1997 and was widely regarded as being the key element in delivering that historic outcome, the first time that an international agreement was made to recognise and cut climate emissions. Former US Vice President Al Gore said that he had, and I quote, never worked with anyone in politics quite like John Prescott. And John continued to take climate issues seriously, and we would have passionate and rather loud conversations on the train as we went to and fro from East Yorkshire. And when I led our delegation to the last year's COP, which was the first to commit to phasing out fossil fuels, I knew that my team and I were following in the footsteps of someone who may have come from a humble background, but went on to change the world.
Becky Gittins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just over 2 months ago, I rose in this chamber for the first time to give my maiden speech. I opened with a comical line about one of my constituency's most famous sons, Lord John Prescott. Though I'm sad to be rising today to commemorate his passing, it's important to reflect the indelible mark that he has left on British politics. A formidable character, John Prescott was a political giant, but never stopped being one of us, an ordinary, down-to-earth, working-class man, whose ambition for communities like his as part of a trailblazing Labour government. Ambitions like his and others are the reason why so many of us are here today. Often underestimated by both his political allies and enemies, he was the glue that held the Labour government together and saw it deliver so much of what it did. Though personally, I knew him little more than as an overly keen teenager at Labour Party conference, asking for a selfie with a political hero. He did oblige, though in his customary unimpressed fashion. But his impact on myself and so many on these benches has been huge. So I rise today, on behalf of the people of Clwyd East, to say a fond farewell to one of our own, a treasured son of North Wales, a political trailblazer, and a true one-off. My thoughts are with Pauline and his family.
Kevin McCann.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to add my words to all these warm tributes to John. I got to know him and encountered him outside of a political context. It's a matter of record that towards the end of his time as Deputy Prime Minister, he had several bouts of ill health and was admitted to hospital on a couple of occasions and was admitted to the critical care unit where I was a nurse at the time. He made an incredible impression on me and my fellow staff. He was actually a really great patient, which, let's face it, not every VIP that ever crosses those words into a ward can that be said of. So, and he was warm and fun and abrasive in the right way and challenging in the right way. You know, one of my most abiding memories is being summoned in to see the Deputy Prime Minister because his hospital food was rubbish. So he wanted to complain about that. Hopefully that will be the only time a Deputy Prime Minister calls me in to criticise something that I'm responsible for, but you never know. After it, a real testament is that John invited all of us staff that had looked after him to come and do a big tour in a very John Prescott way of, you know, in Admiralty House, going all the way through the back corridors of Whitehall and throwing out great bits of history and anecdote. And he finished up with a mock auction where he'd acquired a lot of gewgaws and knickknacks from all of his diplomatic visits abroad. And he was throwing them out with his very strong arm to people in the room, and people were catching them. And hopefully many of those people and colleagues that I had at the time still got some of those items and have treasured him after hearing this. So honestly, I really want to give my heartfelt condolences to Pauline and to John's family. Thank you.
I think the House is always at its best, and I'm sure John would have been smiling at the tributes. I've got to say it was fantastic. The only thing I would add is that John managed to divide Hull into two when he became a Robin, but we'll leave it at that. Right, we now come to urgent question. Let the front benches just change over. Urgent question. Dame Priti Patel, Shadow Foreign Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs if he will make a statement on the government's response to the decision taken by the ICC to issue arrest warrants in respect of the Israel-Gaza conflict.
Mr. Speaker, last Thursday, judges of the International Criminal Court issued arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant, and for the reportedly deceased Mohammed Ibrahim al-Masri, commonly known as Daif, Commander-in-Chief of the military wing of Hamas. The ICC is the primary international institution for investigating and prosecuting the most serious crimes of international concern. It is actively investigating allegations of the gravest crimes in countries around the world, including Ukraine, Sudan, and Libya. In line with this government's stated commitment to the rule of law, we respect the independence of the ICC. We will comply with our international obligations. There is a domestic legal process through our independent courts that determines whether or not to endorse an arrest warrant by the ICC in accordance with the ICC Act of 2001. This process has never been tested because the UK has never been visited by an ICC indictee. If there were to be such a visit to the UK, There would be a court process and due process would be followed in relation to those issues. There is no moral equivalence between Israel, a democracy, and Hamas and Lebanese Hezbollah, two terrorist organisations. This government has been clear. Israel has a right to defend itself in accordance with international law. That right is not under question, Mr. Speaker, and the court's approval of the warrants last week do not change that. Israel is, of course, a partner across UK priorities, including trade, investment, security, and science and technology. We do cooperate across a wide range of issues for our mutual benefit. This government remains focused, Mr. Speaker, on pushing for an immediate ceasefire to bring an end to the devastating violence in Gaza. This is essential to protect civilians, ensure the release of hostages, and to increase humanitarian aid into Gaza. We have always said diplomacy is what will see an end to this conflict, and that can only be achieved through dialogue. It is in the long-term interest of the Israelis, Palestinians, and the wider region to agree to a ceasefire deal urgently and bring this devastating conflict to an end.
Foreign Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, the International Criminal Court's decision to issue arrest warrants for the State of Israel Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and its former Defence Minister Yoav Gallant will do nothing to help secure the release of those poor hostages who've been held captive by Hamas for over a year. Nor will it help to get more aid into Gaza, and it will not deliver a sustainable end to this awful conflict. And in charging Israeli leaders alongside Hamas, the ICC appears to be drawing a moral equivalence between Israel's war of self-defense and Hamas terrorism. We utterly reject any moral equivalence. The only beneficiaries of this decision are Hamas and their terrorist sponsors, Iran, who are now celebrating this propaganda coup as a great victory for Hamas and Hezbollah. Since the ICC's decision, we have had dither from ministers and confused messaging and no clarity, so I'm grateful to the Minister today for his remarks. So the government has indicated already that it will seek to enforce these warrants through our own courts, and there is a process around that. And as to the issue of warrants, we have raised serious concerns over process, jurisdiction, and the position on complementarity principle, and believe the warrants for Mr Netanyahu and Gallant have no basis in international law. So does the government believe the court has jurisdiction in this case, given that Israel is not party to the Rome Statute and Palestine is not a recognised state? Does the Minister agree that the ICC must act within legal norms? And in the absence of the ICC making public the specific context of the charges, does the Minister share concerns expressed about reports of process errors in the ICC's investigation and the concerns that Lord MacDonald, the former DPP, has raised about the use by the prosecutor of an expert panel? And finally, but crucially, what effect does the Minister believe that Mr Netanyahu's immunity under international law as a serving Prime Minister of a country which is not a state party has on enforcing these warrants in the UK's own courts? Mr Speaker, these are important questions. I look forward to the Minister responding, but it is really important that at this time when there is such a conflict taking place, the Minister has already spoken about securing the release of hostages, more aid coming into Gaza, that we have clear clarity from this government. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I welcome the questions from my right honourable friend across the benches. It is, of course, utmost in this government's mind the need to bring an immediate end to the conflict in Gaza, to secure the release of the hostages whose families I have met, and I know the right honourable friend knows that I'm familiar with these issues from my previous life. We also, of course, need to see more aid going into Gaza, and the questions at issue with the ICC are separate from that. Diplomacy will continue regardless of the process of the ICC, but I had understood it to be the common position of this House that the international rule of law is an important commitment. The International Criminal Court is an important, the primary body in enforcing these norms, and the issues on jurisdiction and complementarity were heard by the pre-trial chamber. Its 3 judges have issued their findings, and I think we should respect those.
Chair of the Select Committee, Emily Thornberry.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker.
The International Criminal Court was created when 120 countries put their names to the Rome Statute and signed up to the principle that certain basic standards of behaviour must be enforced internationally. And those laws would be applicable to everyone, no matter who they were. From the time when Winston Churchill led the party opposite, this country has been a proud supporter of international law, and it is wrong for us to try to undermine it. Does my honourable friend share my deep disappointment that the Conservatives have fallen as far as they have?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I think has been clear from the actions of this government from July when we became the government, the international rule of law is incredibly important to this government, and all of our actions will be guided by it.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The conflict between Israel and Hamas has had a devastating impact on Palestinian and Israeli civilians, with women and children paying a particularly terrible price. Now the International Criminal Court has issued arrest warrants for those it believes are culpable. The UK indeed has obligations under international law that we must uphold. The previous Conservative government chose to be selective with those obligations when it came to the ICC's jurisdiction in the occupied Palestinian territories. That was deeply regrettable and damaging for our country. And I greatly regret that the Conservative front bench are pursuing the same line today. It is right that the government has committed to uphold this ruling, and I welcome the Minister's statement that it will support the process to enforce these arrest warrants. But does the Minister share my concern about the words of Republican Senator Lindsey Graham, who has proposed sanctioning nations, including the UK, who uphold this ruling? And can the Minister outline the specific new steps the government is taking to secure an immediate bilateral ceasefire with all parties, so we can put a stop to the humanitarian disaster in Gaza, get the hostages home, and open the door to a two-state solution?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Every member of this government, most particularly the Foreign Secretary and the rest of the Foreign Office ministerial team, are engaged every day, including this morning, in pressing all parties for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, for an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon, and for a de-escalation of violence, of course, in Gaza and the occupied Palestinian territories, but also more broadly in the Middle East, where violence remains far too high.
Andy Slaughter.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for the Prime Minister of a democratic state, which is the UK ally, finding there are reasonable grounds that he is responsible for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Doesn't that call for action as well as words from the UK government, which might include ending trade with illegal settlements, the sanctioning of members of the government and settlers, and indeed the recognition of the state of Palestine, if we are to show not only our disapproval, but how we want to move forward?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I recognise the long commitment to these issues from my honourable friends. I will not comment further, as you'd expect, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the ICC process, which needs to now carry through in accordance with due process and in the way that you would expect. And on the issues of sanctions, which have been discussed in this chamber before, I'm not at liberty to provide any further commentary on who we might consider for sanctions in the usual way.
Oliver Dowden.
Whatever reservations one may have about the conduct of the conflict in Gaza, there are two fundamental principles. One, Netanyahu is a democratically elected leader of a sovereign state, and two, that state is conducting a legitimate war of self-defence. Now, the Minister acknowledges those facts, but does he not appreciate how this ruling is seen as an affront to those principles by many of my constituents?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm slightly stumped by the questions opposite. We're signatories to the ICC Act. I think the whole House agrees with the importance of the rule of law. Representations have been made to the ICC in the pre-trial chamber, and they have found they have come to their decisions. I think we should respect their independence.
Tan Singh Desi.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I find it shocking but not surprising that the Conservative Party has chosen to downgrade and disparage the highly respected International Criminal Court. We're a nation that upholds the rule of law. So I am very proud that the new Labour government has chosen to respect the independence of the ICC. With ICC arrest warrants against Benjamin Netanyahu, Yoav Gallant and Mohammed Deif, who, on the basis that there are reasonable grounds that they bear criminal responsibility for potential war crimes, does the Minister agree that it is important that we respect the independence of that ICC judgment and that, if required, we implement the said finding?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I'm not really able to go much further than to say that there is a domestic legal process through our independent courts that would determine whether or not to endorse an arrest warrant. We would follow the due process in the way that you would expect, and this is a decision not for government ministers but for an independent court.
David Davies.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister may be aware I've fought the corner for international courts time and time again in this House, and I view upholding the authority of those courts and the reputation of those courts as very important. The difficulty here is not just that Israel is a democracy, but it has an internal independent judiciary, which puts a limit on what any government can do in Israel, which is why equating or appearing to equate Netanyahu with all the other monsters that the International Criminal Court has quite properly prosecuted risks bringing the court into disrepute.
Where's the limit?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I know that the Right Honourable Member has looked at these issues over a long period of time. Questions of complementarity are, of course, important, and I understand they were considered by the pre-trial chamber.
Florence Eshamole.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Several of our allies and international partners have outlined their commitment fully supporting the ICC, including Canada, the Netherlands, Sweden, Belgium and Ireland. So I welcome the government's commitment in respecting the independence of the ICC. Does the Minister agree that the ICC has a very high evidential threshold when it comes to the issuing of arrest warrants for alleged perpetrators? And has this now not been demonstrated with this case?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The deliberations of the ICC on this matter have gone on for some time, and I think it's been clear for all to see the way in which they've proceeded, and I welcome them.
Leila Moran.
Last week I attended a memorial service for the people of Gaza with families of Palestinian origin here in the UK. I believe the ministers met with some of those representatives already. And we heard from a woman called Kitam, who described how overnight she lost 48 members of her family. And she, as she walked back, sat behind me and broke down in sobs as she remembered so painfully that day. She deserves justice. This issuing of a warrant is not justice. There is still a process to go through. There is still a trial to be had. But is it not right that whatever the court, those outcomes are adhered to? So might I press him on the ruling of the ICJ advisory opinion on the occupation? Because at the core of this is that ruling. And that should mean that we are doing much more than just meeting with those families and sharing in their pain.
Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As the Honourable Member alludes, I've met with these families as well, and many other families who have been so wounded by the conduct of this conflict over the course of the last year on both sides, both the hostage families and the many Palestinians and Lebanese who've seen their lives so cruelly turned upside down. As I said earlier, in the end, it is only diplomacy that will bring an end to this conflict. We will continue to have contact with all sides, including those indicted. We will continue to press all those with whom we engage to bring an early end to this war. In relation to the ICJ, we've set out our position before. We are considering the judgment carefully. We've provided an explanation of our position so far in the United Nations. It is an important, far-reaching judgment, and we hope to be able to say more in due course.
Sarah Owen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the Minister's confirmation that the UK will be upholding the ICC arrest warrants for the Hamas general and Israeli leaders. The ICC found grounds to believe that Netanyahu and Gallant each bear criminal responsibility for the war crime of starvation as a method of warfare and the crimes against humanity of murder, persecution and other humane acts. It goes on to say the crime of intentionally directing an attack against the civilian population. On that last point, what moral justification is there now for continuing arms sales used by Israeli forces at the behest of a Prime Minister accused of such serious war crimes? When will we use every diplomatic lever to stop the killing, free all hostages and stop selling arms to a country led by someone accused of such horrific war crimes?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to just be clear that what I've said this afternoon is not that the government will uphold arrest warrants. What I have been clear about this afternoon is that due process will be followed. These are questions for independent courts in the UK, and it is independent courts that would review the arrest warrants if that situation were to arise. My honourable friend asks about aid. I want to be absolutely clear, insufficient aid is getting into Gaza. I travelled myself to the Gaza border and saw the restrictions Israel is putting on aid reaching Gaza. Those restrictions have been called out by me and other members of the Foreign Office day in, day out. We are taking steps with our partners and our allies to try and ensure that those in Gaza have the aid that they need as winter comes in order to survive. These are grave matters, and I understand the frustration of right across this House that we have not seen the amount of aid in Gaza that we would like to see. And I recognise that people are asking for yet more to be done. We, of course, in relation to the specific question about the arms licence suspensions that were announced to this House on the 2nd of September, we will, of course, keep that under review, and we will consider the findings of the ICC in relation to that assessment.
Stephen Flynn.
Speaker, last year the Labour Party had to be dragged into accepting that there was a collective punishment of the Palestinian people. Indeed, the honourable gentleman's boss said that war is ugly. The Labour Party earlier this year had to be dragged into even uttering the words ceasefire. So can I ask him, will he show the leadership that his bosses failed to do and say that if Benjamin Netanyahu's feet touch the ground in the UK, you will comply with the arrest warrant?
Sorry, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think I wasn't quite quick enough on my feet. The honourable member says with dismay, war is ugly. War is ugly. And we are doing everything that we can to bring it to a close through all of the diplomatic measures that you would expect. This is not an issue for grandstanding. This is an issue for diplomacy, and that is what this government is committed to.
Apsana Begum.
Surely central to the debate today must be the UK's ongoing political role as Israel's close ally, and the fact that UK-made weapons, including components, are still being used by Israel. Does the Minister recognise that beyond the commitment to uphold the ICC's arrest warrants, the UK's failure to clearly condemn the collective punishment of civilians, an intent explicitly indicated by key Israeli leading figures, and the continued military support for Israel's ongoing onslaught in Gaza have serious implications for the UK's own human rights obligations and the fate of millions of innocent men, women and children?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the my honourable friend for her question. I won't rehearse too much the answers provided on the 2nd of September and on numerous occasions in this chamber since then. We have suspended with one exemption, which I'm happy to turn to again, all of the arms that we are selling to Israel that could be used in Gaza. That suspension, in our assessment, also covers the West Bank and Lebanon. We are taking action in accordance with our commitments under international humanitarian law, and we will continue to do so.
Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Mr. Speaker, can we be absolutely clear about what the government is saying? Because it seems the government is not saying there would be an automatic arrest should Benjamin Netanyahu arrive in this country, that there would be due process. And could he confirm that customarily international law does not permit the arrest or the delivering of the Prime Minister of a non-state party to the ICC? So he's committing to due process, but he's not committing to arrest. Am I correct in understanding that?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There's a domestic legal process through our independent courts. We cannot prejudge that process. I note that the Shadow Attorney General has written to the Attorney General on questions of detail in relation to some of the points you allude to, and the Attorney General tells me he will be writing back on those more detailed points.
Nashar. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Whilst we work tirelessly to get a ceasefire in Gaza, which is really important, simply because the children don't see an end in sight, neither do the families in Gaza. Does the Minister also agree with me that Britain's reputation on the world scene as a global leader for upholding justice would be undermined if Britain did not respect the independence of the ICC, as those on the Conservative benches are implying?
Madam Deputy Speaker, this government thinks that adherence to international law and being seen to adhere to international law is incredibly important, and in everything we've done since July, we have sought to underline that principle, and I would hope that it would be one that the whole House would support us in.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Minister has assured us that the arrest warrants will be carried out, and I hope that is the case. Could he also consider that if an arrest warrant has been issued for the leader of a country, if the International Court of Justice has found it deeply wanting on its behaviour and as an occupying power and the war crimes that have been committed, why are we still supplying weapons that are taking part in the bombardment of Gaza that are destroying life as we speak?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. As I said in answer to a question from my own benches, we took steps on the 2nd of September to ensure that, with one exemption, which I'm happy to go into, that we are not selling arms which are being used, which could pose a breach of international humanitarian law in Gaza, and that continues to be the position, and it is kept under regular review.
Abtisam Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC's decision is a crucial step to ensuring justice and accountability for the crimes against humanity committed in Gaza and Israel. It is vital that the government acts without fear or favour in order to uphold the international rules-based system. War crimes are wrong, whoever commits them and wherever they happen, whether by Russian forces in unlawfully occupied Ukraine or by Israeli forces in an unlawfully occupied Palestinian territory. Will the Minister now review all diplomatic, economic and political relations with Israel to ensure our country is not complicit with the atrocities taking place in Gaza, the West Bank and in Lebanon?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I can confirm that the Department keeps its and the Government as a whole keeps its international obligations under close review, including in relation to the theatres described.
Monica Harding.
Madam Deputy Speaker, last week I was in the West Bank and saw for myself the incursions by settlers into the occupied Palestinian territories, following recent comments from Israel's far-right finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, describing in explicit terms the active effort to annex the West Bank to Israel. Does the Minister agree that now is the time to sanction Smotrich?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the comments of Finance Minister Smotrich have been condemned in this chamber before, and we can reiterate those condemnations. But as my friend would expect, we cannot put comment on sanctions which may or may not be under consideration in the usual way.
Matt Weston.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm no friend of Hamas, but we must remember that Prime Minister Netanyahu promised us intelligence-led precision attacks in Gaza. What we've seen is daily violation of international law, 43,000 people killed, restrictions on food aid, 136 journalists killed. So I welcome the government and its announcement to respect the ICC's decision. But can I urge us also to consider all levers, including sanctions against 2 of the Israeli government ministers, and also sanctions against the settlers in the West Bank and other organisations operating therein.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will not comment on what sanctions may be under review for reasons which are well established, but I would draw my honourable friend's attention to the sanctions that we have already taken in October against Israeli settlers and organisations involved in both breaches of international law and violence in the West Bank.
Bob Blackman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Our closest ally is the United States of America, and there has been widespread condemnation of these arrest warrants being issued by across both the House of Representatives and Congress. What effect does the Minister think this decision will have on our relationship with the United States of America, particularly with the new incoming administration, which has very different views?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the UK is a state party to their own statute, and this brings with it obligations that put us in a different position from the US. We will, of course, continue to engage both with the current and the incoming US administration in the shared interests of our 2 countries across the full range of our priorities.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The atrocities that led to the issuing of the arrest warrants continue to this day, not least in healthcare facilities, where we see the devastating stories coming out of Gaza. However, my honourable friend has set out his frustration at aid not reaching those very facilities, and yet there is more sanction that could be applied by this government. So why will he not escalate now the UK's response to the Israeli government by placing those sanctions so they really feel the real pain of our country, but also understand that we want to ensure that justice is served by the ICC?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to reassure the House how focused the government is on the question of aid access into Gaza. As I say, I've travelled to the region and I've raised these issues repeatedly with all parties, including the Israeli government. We need to see a flood of aid into Israel. That is what has been the commitment of the Israeli government, and I regret that we have not yet seen that flood of aid and that Palestinians are suffering as a consequence. Winter is coming, and Palestinians in Gaza are extremely vulnerable, and we will continue to press the Israeli government to do everything that it can to ensure that more aid reaches Gaza and indeed into all parts of the occupied Palestinian territories that require it. I made these points forcefully this morning, and I will continue to make them.
Liz Saville-Roberts.
The ICC has issued arrest warrants for crimes including direct attacks on civilians. Open source information shows that the RAF reconnaissance flights are going over Gaza and average nearly 4 flights a day. While, of course, we all seek the information necessary to gain the release of the hostages, how confident is he that the information used and shared with Israel from these flights has not been used to facilitate any attacks on civilians?
Good question.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I will not go into operational details, but I can assure the House these surveillance aircraft are unarmed, do not have a combat role, and are tasked solely to locate hostages, including a British national, and they will continue to do so.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In response to the Right Honourable Member for Whittam, I note that the UK, under the previous Conservative government, signed an ICC state party statement in support of the ICC and to preserve it from political interference just before the election. And the Foreign Secretary has confirmed the UK's acceptance and respect for the ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu's war crimes. Therefore, isn't it now incumbent on the government to take effective, concrete steps to prevent further such acts by banning all arms licences to Israel, including F-35 parts, and imposing sanctions on individuals, on assets, goods trading with the illegally occupied West Bank, and the urgent recognition of Palestinian statehood?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I won't rehearse the points that we've already discussed on sanctions. The Foreign Secretary set out our position both in relation to the suspension of arms licences and the F-35 exemptions, and that remains the position. We will keep our assessments under regular review, including the findings of the ICC.
Adnan Hussain.
Thank you, Deputy Madam Speaker. Frankly, I'm disappointed. The government isn't giving any clear responses. I therefore ask you, in October 2023, over 800 experts in international law and conflicts and genocide studies, they gave a warning of clear prospects of genocide. In November 2023, over 40 United Nations experts called it a genocide in the making. Then we get the ICJ judgment that called it a plausible genocide. And then we had a judge from the ICJ saying the alarm has now been sounded by the court. All the indicators of genocidal activities are flashing red in Gaza. And now we have an arrest warrant. Does this government stand by its conviction that genocide is not being committed in Gaza? Yes or no?
Yeah. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think it's important that we treat the international institutions with the respect that they deserve. This is an indictment from the ICC, and we respect it. The ICJ, through the process that you refer to, has not found. It is in an advisory opinion stage, and we need to treat international law with the respect that it deserves.
Imran Hussain.
Madam Deputy Speaker, and the Minister will be aware that, as well as the ICC's recent decision to issue arrest warrants, there is now an entire body of international law, including the ICJ advisory opinion adopted by the UN General Assembly, ruling Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories illegal, and South Africa's case at the ICJ on genocide, that points towards a very clear position in international law. Does the Minister therefore agree that if we are to preserve the integrity of the international rules-based order, then we must start by ending the international hypocrisy and double standards and reaffirm that all states, including the UK, have an absolute obligation under international law to act now to bring all those who commit war crimes to justice?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his question. I want to underline this government's commitments to ending accountability for war crimes, and we stand against international crimes of this nature in all places, everywhere, and our commitment to international law is one of the most powerful levers we have in trying to prevent war crimes.
Paul Holmes.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I asked for the Minister's forgiveness because I didn't hear whether he answered this question to my right honourable friend, the Shadow Foreign Secretary. But is it his understanding that under customary international law, it does not permit the arrest or delivery of a serving Prime Minister of a non-state party to the ICC, and that the UK seeking to arrest the Prime Minister would not only breach our international obligations, but would also be unlawful under the ICC Act 2001?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. For the awareness of the House, the Shadow Attorney General has written about the two different legal interpretations of immunity and sought the Attorney General's view on these matters. I think the Shadow Attorney General is acknowledging that this would be a case that courts would be the competent authority on, but he has undertaken to respond to that letter, and he will do in due course.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The law is the law, and the evidence is the evidence. Whether it's politically convenient, whether it helps us diplomatically or not, the law is the law. The International Criminal Court has been absolutely clear on what they think. Can I just say to my honourable friend, the Minister, that he is absolutely right to reject the calls opposite, to turn this into a political decision and to leave this as an independent legal decision for our courts and for the International Criminal Court, and he should carry on exactly the way he is.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I agree.
Caroline Verdon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the decision by the ICC, and I sincerely hope that we will live up to our international obligations if the Prime Minister of Israel visits the UK. You have said yourself that you regret the fact that more aid isn't getting into Gaza and that you've been calling out the Israeli government for not letting more aid in. Is it not time now to do more than just calling out the Israeli government and telling them how angry you are? Isn't it time now that you end all arms exports to Israel, that you impose sanctions, end trade with all the illegal settlements and recognise Palestine as a state?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We will continue to press these points with vigour, and we will continue to keep all of the other measures under review, as I've said already in this chamber.
Before I call the next speaker, can I just remind members not to use the word you? I call Melanie Ward.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Madam Deputy Speaker, I thought the Conservative Party styled itself as the party of law and order. But that's increasingly not the case when it comes to international law, it seems. The government is right to uphold the decision of the ICC, and it was right to vote for the UN Security Council motion on a ceasefire last week. The Minister will be aware that there is increasing evidence of forcible displacement of Palestinians from the north of Gaza, including from organisations such as Human Rights Watch. He will be aware that this is a crime against humanity, and that two of the main proponents of this are Israeli Ministers Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. The Prime Minister has confirmed that the government is looking at this, so when will the government move to sanction them as part of a wider package of further action to uphold international law?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We follow reports from northern Gaza closely and with concern, and have raised many of these issues repeatedly. As I've said already, I won't comment further on sanctions, but that I wish to be clear that forced displacement of Palestinians outside of Gaza is not consistent with Israel's obligations.
Stephen Geffins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Minister agree with me that one of the greatest tools that we have against tyranny anywhere is that, friend or foe, rich or poor, elected or unelected, the law applies to everybody, and the universality of certain crimes means that they can be prosecuted anywhere?
Madam Deputy Speaker, as I hope I've made clear this afternoon, this government is committed to the international rule of law and will continue to be so.
Sarah Sultana.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Despite what the Minister has said, last week at the Royal Courts of Justice, the government conceded that UK-made F-35 parts could be used in violations of international law in Gaza, and admitted that Israel has shown no commitment to upholding these legal obligations. Despite this, the government has continued to authorise offensive F-35 arms exports, exposing itself to criminal liability. It's disappointing that the Foreign Secretary isn't here today, so will the Minister let our constituents know if the government will end its complicity in genocide, impose sanctions and end all arms sales? And will the Minister confirm that should Netanyahu, who faces an ICC arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity, enter UK territory, he will be immediately arrested? Yes or no?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll return briefly to the statement made by the Foreign Secretary on the 2nd of September. Suspending all licences for the F-35 programme would undermine the global F-35 supply chain that is vital for the security of the UK, our allies and NATO. He set out on the 2nd of September how the suspension of armed license would apply to direct sale of F-35 components to Israel, but not to the global supply chain. That continues to be the position.
Shirka Adam.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. 43,000 dead, possibly 100,000 under the rubble. Schools, hospitals destroyed, and 16,000 children killed, including by drones and shot in the head. Many of my members and honourable friends have mentioned that this was a genocide mentioned many months ago. Now that the ICC prosecutor has called Benjamin Netanyahu a serious war criminal, a potential serious war criminal and committing crimes against humanity, does the Minister agree with me that it is now the time to recognise the State of Palestine and all military and financial cooperation with the Israeli government, while its leaders are essentially international fugitives?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I won't rehearse our position on the recognition of the State of Palestine other than to say we believe that the Palestinians have an inalienable right to a state alongside a safe and secure Israel, and as part, this government hopes to take steps to advance that as part of a contribution to a two-state solution. The honourable member suggests no contact at all with the Israeli government, I think, as a consequence of the ICC ruling. It is only diplomacy that will bring an end to this conflict. We will continue to have direct contacts, and in those direct contacts, Madam Deputy Speaker, we will continue to do all that we can to secure an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, aid into Gaza, and a more safe and secure, stable Middle East.
John MacDonald.
Can I just say to my honourable friend, I say this as constructively as I possibly can, but a number of us have sat here for a number of months and questions have been asked about sanctions, and the response from ministers is that we cannot comment on sanctions in the House. Can I say that renders sanctions ineffective? In addition to that, it breaks down the accountability of ministers to this House as well, and we deserve a better statement than that. Could I also ask him on the legal process itself? He's quite right when he said we will respect international law, we will comply with the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction and decisions. And he said it will be for the, if I get the wording right, it will be for the domestic legal processes involved. Where does physical arrest come within that domestic legal process?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let me deal with the question of why we don't provide advance comment on sanctions, and then I'll turn, if I may, to the question about the domestic legal process. So, I hear my right honourable friend. The reason we do not provide commentary on sanctions is that to do so in advance would reduce their effect. I think, and I have my colleague sat next to me, but I would think that we have issued probably upwards of 50, maybe even 100 sanctions in the short time that we've been the government. There has been no shortage of sanctions for this House to comment on. I recognise the two that I've been pressed on the most this afternoon are of intense political interest. But despite their intense political interest, were we to prejudge sanctions and trail them in this House before we made them, we would reduce their impact. The same is true of the hundreds of sanctions that we have done on Russia over the years, and it would be the same in every forum. In relation to the domestic legal process, I hope my right honourable friend will forgive me for not entering too deeply into hypotheticals about how we might, how a court might discharge its findings on these matters.
John Cooper.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you. Israel is a democracy, and its courts have in the past shown themselves unafraid to put even senior politicians on trial. What assessment then has the Minister made of the Israelis' own ability to bring human rights cases in their own courts?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. This is described in international law as the question of complementarity, and it was considered by the pre-trial chamber, and given the independence of the ICC, I don't think it's appropriate for me to offer further commentary. Arguments were made by various states on this matter, and the pre-trial chamber came to its findings.
Afzal Khan.
Does the Minister agree that as well as demanding an immediate ceasefire, free all hostages, unhindered aid getting into Gaza, we must ensure that the perpetrators of heinous war crimes and crimes against humanity are held to account under international law, whether they are friend or foe, based on justice that is blind, objective, and impartial. Playing politics with courts undermines justice.
I thank my honourable friend for his question. Support for international criminal justice and accountability has traditionally been a matter on which we have had widespread support in this House, and it will continue to be a priority for the British Government.
Ellie Chowns.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC, the world's highest criminal court, has reasonable grounds to allege that the Israeli leaders are guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. And the other world court, the International Court of Justice, has found there is plausible risk Israel is committing genocide against Palestinians and that Israel's occupation and annexation is unlawful. So may I ask the Minister two questions. First of all, does he agree that the UK has itself obligations under international law to prevent genocide, to bring Israel's unlawful occupation to an end and to bring suspected perpetrators of grave breaches of international law to justice? And second, quite simply, what will the UK do differently as a result of the decisions of the ICC and the ICJ? He says he'll pull out all of the stops. We've had many suggestions here today, including stopping of the export of F-35s. What will the government do differently?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. So, does the government accept that we have international obligations? Indeed, we do. I've set out how we would discharge them in relation to the ICC this afternoon. I've set out also the view that we take on the ICJ process. We will continue to do everything that we can to ensure that there is proper international justice which is abided by all. We are one of the ICC's major funders. We commit 13.2 million a year to ensure that the ICC can function properly. In everything that this government does, we are trying to ensure the international rule of law, and we will continue to do so.
Bel Ribeiro Abbey.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The UK has a responsibility not just to respect the independence of international courts, but to take active steps to promote compliance with international obligations. Where nations or leaders have been accused of committing war crimes, the UK has held itself as a global leader in placing sanctions. It is unconscionable that in this situation we are yet to stop all sales of arms to Israel. And if Israel is accused of committing war crimes, doesn't the continued sale of any arms to Israel make the UK potentially complicit? Given the gravity of this situation, can the Minister clarify further why he cannot comment on sanctions, or indeed the other steps the government is planning or willing to take to make clear the UK's condemnation of the continued slaughter of civilians in Gaza?
Madam Deputy Speaker, let me comment on arms sales as they've been raised again. I won't rehearse the arguments about the F-35 exemption. In relation to the arms that are sold, or the arms that are licensed to be sold to Israel, there is the category that have been suspended, and that is the category that was that posed a risk to be involved in a risk of breaches of international humanitarian law in Gaza. Those weapons, we also believe, would be the weapons at issue in the West Bank and in Lebanon. There's a second category of weapons that are for resale elsewhere, which are not relevant to events in Israel. There is a third category of weapons where they are used either for defensive purposes or in purposes that I think nobody in this House would disagree. Body armour and helmets for aid workers going into Gaza, for example. I would say gently to colleagues right across the House that there is not, in the rest of the arms sales, some solution to the dilemma that faces us. The suspension of arms sales has been done carefully, aimed at the potential breach of international humanitarian law. It has been reached carefully and judiciously, and including in relation to the F-35. That is the position as it remains.
Neil Shastri-Hurst.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I have a certain degree of sympathy with the Minister who has been asked to substitute in lieu of the Foreign Secretary here today. So I'll ask him a question of fact. Does the Minister recognise that pursuant to Section 23, subsection 6 of the International Criminal Court Act 2001, representatives of a non-state party in the Rome Statute will remain immune from prosecution unless that non-state party expressly waives that right to the ICC.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't need sympathy, just careful listening. It's the same question asked by your colleague, and it's the same answer. This has been raised by the Shadow Attorney General to the Attorney General, and you'll get a letter in due course.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I must press the Minister on this question of F-35 arms sales. The Minister mentions direct and indirect arms sales. The Minister says that the indirect arms sales are either irrelevant or impossible to remedy. As far as I understand it, Madam Deputy Speaker, there is no reason why F-35 parts made in the UK and sold to the United States and then used in Israel cannot be subject to a conditional licence which sees them still sold to the United States on the proviso that they cannot be used in Gaza. So, given this, in what way can it be legally or morally justified to continue allowing UK parts for fighter jets that are being used to kill Palestinian children to be exported, even indirectly, to an Israeli leader facing an arrest warrant for war crimes and crimes against humanity? And we hear about the review, but while the ongoing review has been taking place both under the last government and under this government, thousands and thousands of Palestinian civilians have been killed.
Madam Deputy Speaker, just for clarity on the F-35 programme, we have suspended arms licences where parts for the F-35 programme are sold directly to Israel. Where they are sold to the global spares pool, it is not possible to then disentangle from where they go in that pool to their final destination. That is why we have made the exemptions. That is why we judge that making that exemption is vital for the security of the UK, for our allies and for NATO.
Andrew George.
Madam Deputy Speaker, does the Minister agree that the cold-blooded slaughter of tens of thousands of innocent people in Gaza cannot be justified in terms of self-defence? And contrary to the Trumpian line adopted by the Conservative benches, does the Minister also agree that just because a country is a democracy, it doesn't provide it with an immunity blanket from international law?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Honourable Member refers to the terrible loss of life in Gaza, which I know is in the minds and the hearts of this whole House. We are a democracy, as much as signatories to petitions may wish it otherwise. We abide by international law and we expect our allies to do the same, and we make that point with force.
Chris Law.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Let's remind this House why we're here. Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant stand accused of very serious crimes. The crime against humanity of murder, the crime against humanity of persecution and starvation is a weapon of war. 70% of those killed in this war are innocent women and children. Nobody in this House in living memory remembers a war where 70% of women and children that are killed are in this war like this. So I would like to ask a very specific question, because you've evaded all of this so far. Can you tell us one concrete step, apart from executing the arrest warrants, as the UK is obliged to do as a state party to the Rome Statute, one concrete step that we can all tangibly grasp after these ICC arrest warrants that you're going to do next? We'd like to hear it now, please. Thank you.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've been clear about what it is the government has done and will continue to do, but if the honourable member would like a recap, on the very first morning that I became a minister, we announced the restoration of funding to UNRWA. We have provided significant aid to the people of Gaza. We have provided aid which has not got in to Gaza. We have raised that with the Israelis. Me and my ministerial colleagues have travelled to the region to press these issues, both alone and in company, with the French Foreign Minister. What we face, this House is united in its concern about what will happen in Gaza over the course of December. There is no disagreement that insufficient aid has gone in. There are urgent, almost frantic efforts every day in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office to try to ensure that adequate aid reaches the Palestinians. I understand the frustration of this House. We are working as hard as we can. We will continue to do so. We take concrete action each and every day on this issue.
Tracy Gilbert.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ICC found that there is no justification under international humanitarian law for the restrictions of aid by the Israeli government. Indeed, the ICC detailed how doctors have been forced to carry out treatments and amputations without anaesthetics, including on children. The government's response must include redoubling our efforts to get more aid into Gaza. Can my right honourable friend confirm what pressure is being put on the Israeli government in addition to what we've already done to get more aid into Gaza?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. In addition to the steps that I just outlined, we'll be working closely with our partners, and I hope to be able to update this House shortly on some of the measures we are taking in company to try and ensure that sufficient aid gets into Gaza, particularly over this vital winter period.
Iqbal Mohammed.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The ICC arrest warrants are welcome, but in themselves will not bring an end to Israeli war crimes and ethnic cleansing and the killing of innocent men, women and children. It is an international legal obligation on the UK government to prevent ethnic cleansing and to prevent genocide. Will the Minister explain what specific measures the government has and is taking to stop Israel's ethnic cleansing in northern Gaza? And will he explain what concrete steps the UK government has taken to comply with the Genocide Convention?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The honourable member asked about northern Gaza and some of the specific measures that have been taken. As I said in answer to a previous question, we have been paying close attention to events in northern Gaza. By way of example, we watched closely with horror the events at Kamal Addan Hospital. I raised this myself repeatedly with the Israeli authorities and urged them to preserve life at that hospital, including with the children. We take every opportunity to underline to the Israelis their responsibilities as an occupying power in the whole of Gaza, but in northern Gaza in particular, and indeed the obligations that fall to them, Madam Deputy Speaker, in relation to medical facilities, and particularly where there is ongoing treatment of children, as there was in that case. I recognise the honourable member's frustration about the situation in northern Gaza. We are clear, northern Gaza must not be cut off from the south. There must be no forcible transfer of Gazans from or within Gaza, nor any reduction in the territory of the Gaza Strip. The government of Israel must minimise evacuation notices to only areas where it's militarily necessary, provide timely and consistent information on when and where they take effect, and be clear on where it is safe for civilians to move to. The polio vaccination rollout has now ended, but an estimated 6,800 to 13,700 children in northern Gaza were not reached due to intense IDF activity. This is deplorable. Delayed vaccination of any child in Gaza puts them at risk and is unacceptable, and we make these points to the Israelis. I recognise the members' frustration. We are doing what we can to try and ensure that children and others in northern Gaza have access to the aid that they need.
Dan Aldridge.
Madam Deputy Speaker, so many of my constituents have written to me and to express their horror at what is happening in Gaza. Does the Minister agree with me that UNRWA plays an indispensable role in the provision of humanitarian assistance, and does he oppose the bills recently passed in the Knesset that would prevent UNRWA's operation? Thank you.
thank the honourable member, Madam Deputy Speaker, for passing on the concerns of his constituents, which I know is felt right across the country, and that many members would wish to put on record the concern of their constituents as well. I do condemn the Knesset bill in relation to UNRWA. We've made this point clear. UNRWA is indispensable. Only UNRWA can provide the aid at the scale required into the occupied Palestinian territories, and we will continue to press for UNRWA's continued operation in accordance with the relevant Security Council resolutions.
Clive Jones.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is crucial that the Labour government must comply with our obligations under international law to uphold the ICC's ruling and enforce the arrest warrants against Israeli ministers. This compliance is vital, given the previous Conservative government's besmirching of the International Criminal Court and in turn damaging the UK's standing on the world stage. Many of my constituents in Wokingham would like to see that the UK stands up for what is right and would like to see that the UK does not turn its back on international law. So will the Secretary of State confirm that the government will not undermine the ICC's ruling by unequivocally agreeing to uphold the arrest warrants?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'd like to reassure the honourable member and ask him to pass on to his constituents that this government will indeed do the right thing and stand up for international law, and I've set out the manner in which we would do that over the course of this afternoon.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the government's commitment to uphold its obligations under international law and therefore to commit to issuing arrest warrants to these men if they step foot on British soil. But I do ask the Minister, if the government acknowledges that the Prime Minister of Israel should be on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity, how, morally and legally, can we continue to supply him with the weapons which are being used by Israel in its horrific assault on innocent civilians in Gaza?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I've outlined our position both in relation to our international and domestic obligations to the ICC, and I've outlined the position on arms sales. I can reassure my honourable friends that we consider the findings of the ICC in the ongoing review process in relation to arms sales.
Ayub Khan.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I say I'm truly perplexed? No doubt most of the British population that's watching this debate will be truly perplexed by some of the arguments that are being advanced. Issues when it comes to the ICC, topics such as morality or equivalence, don't feature. This is a principle of law. An independent body encapsulating some of the most senior members of the judiciary have made a finding, and yet we have issues of democracy or morality being used as some sort of impunity against leaders. Will the Minister state that if Benjamin Netanyahu arrived on these shores, even if the ICC have issued warrants, would we at least detain him subject to our domestic procedures?
Madam Deputy Speaker, the member makes a impassioned and welcome commitment to due process and the independence of the law, and I won't demur from that by providing commentary on what domestic courts might do in a hypothetical situation.
Yuan Yang.
I'm frankly astonished at the principle underlining some of the comments made by the Shadow Foreign Secretary and some of her Conservative colleagues today. I've been giving assemblies to primary school children across Early and Woodley constituency, emphasising that British democracy means that nobody is above the rule of law. I hope that one day the members of the Conservative Party opposite might understand what the children of Early and Woodley constituency instinctively understand, which is that we should be equal above the law, whether or not we are the political leaders of a democracy or otherwise. And that is why I welcome the Minister's statement that the government will comply with its international obligations. Now, the Minister has set out the work he has been doing in travelling to the region and in witnessing firsthand the blockage of aid by the Israeli government into Gaza. The United Nations states that over 83% of food aid has been blocked. And of course, this leads to the risk, an ongoing fact of starvation in the region. So I ask the Minister what he can do, what the government can do, in line with our positive obligation under international law to prevent future atrocities occurring in Gaza.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The government is deeply concerned by the latest IPC finding about the situation in relation to food insecurity in Gaza. We are making efforts to try and ensure that a more rapid and regular flow of aid, including items that have been barred. Those items that have been barred seem to particularly often be the items most vital for winterization, as the international humanitarian community call it, in Gaza, and we will continue to press for more flexibility on these points, so the necessary tents, sleeping bags and other equipment required to safeguard Palestinian life over the course of the winter is able to move in at the scale that is required.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I haven't seen and lived through in Northern Ireland the misuse of lawfare whereby the terrorist uses law to target those who seek to live by the law, and terrorists ignores the premise that every one of their actions are illegal. I very firmly oppose the UK stamp of approval on any ICC decision on Israel. It is only when you, and not you the Minister, but you, me, have been the victim in Northern Ireland, as unionists have, of the whitewashing propaganda, that you truly understand the danger. Will the Minister not recall that Israel has been defending itself under perpetual attack, and that this ICC ruling is simply affirming the Hamas agenda of hiding terrorism behind women and children and sacrificing them to achieve their goal, which is clear, to wipe Israel off the map? And this is something that we can never support. I hope the Minister will never support it either.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do not support the actions of Hamas. I condemn them outright and utterly. But the actions of Hamas, the continued keeping of hostages in unspeakable cruelty, both to the Israeli people, but indeed to British nationals as well. And we do not forget Emily Damari, still held more than a year since she was taken. That being said, we can both condemn terrorist organisations like Hamas, like Lebanese Hezbollah, and also encourage our allies to stand to the very highest standards, and our commitment to international law is part of that contribution.
Laura Kirk-Smith.
Madam Deputy Speaker. I've just returned from the West Bank, where I met with Roland Friedrich, Director of UNRWA Affairs, and saw UNRWA's work firsthand, which in the West Bank alone includes running 97 schools, 43 health centres, and providing public services like clean drinking water and rubbish collection. Does the Minister agree that there is no viable alternative to UNRWA, and will he do everything in his power to ensure that Israel allows its vital operations to continue?
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I do agree there is no alternative to UNRWA, and we will raise these points both directly with Israel and in company. It is vital that UNRWA, underpinned by a succession of UN Security Council resolutions, is able to continue its vital work both in West Bank and in Gaza and across the wider region.
Richard Quigley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can the Minister reassure us that he and other ministers have directly pressed Israel on compliance with international humanitarian law in their meetings with their counterparts?
Madam Deputy Speaker, I can, and I did this morning, and I will continue to do so.
Peter Prinsley.
Madam Deputy Speaker, Emily is a British citizen, held hostage, as the Minister has said, ever since these attacks. Would the Minister explain what measures the government is taking to make contact with those holding the hostages so that we can bring Emily home?
Madam Deputy Speaker, hostage cases are some of the most horrifying situations that a family could face. A year on, the agony that Emily's family feel, and I know many people in this House have met with her family and have seen firsthand the bravery but also the agony that faces them all. I regret deeply that the best chance of release for all of the hostages is the negotiated agreements, and I call on all parties to come back to the table in order to try and advance the agreement necessary to secure a release of hostages, an immediate ceasefire and a reduction in the awful violence that scars us all.
We now move on to the statement, and I'll give a few moments for the front benches to settle. Secretary of State Steve Reid.
Thank you. With permission, Madam Deputy Speaker, I would like to update the House on Storm Bert. The storm brought heavy rain, high winds and snow across the UK over the weekend. The Flooding Minister and I are receiving regular updates on the flooding in England. Our thoughts and our sympathies are with all those who have been affected. This morning, I held an emergency meeting with the Environment Agency Chief Executive Philip Duffy to discuss the flooding response and ongoing plans to protect communities. I was briefed on the latest situation, the 24/7 response being led by the Environment Agency and the emergency services, and the actions being taken to further protect communities in the coming days, with river levels expected to rise further in some places. We discussed how to bolster the response from the Environment Agency, emergency services and local authorities if required. Flooding in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland is dealt with by the devolved authorities. The Prime Minister spoke to the First Minister for Wales on Sunday, and the Welsh Government has activated its crisis management arrangements in support of the local response. We have offered additional support to our colleagues in Wales if and when that is required. I would like to put on record my thanks to the emergency responders, local authorities and the Environment Agency for their immense efforts to help communities across the country. Around 28,000 properties have been protected by Environment Agency flood defences. Unfortunately, an estimated 107 properties have flooded across England, principally from river and surface water flooding. While Storm Bert has now passed, we will continue to see the impacts of this weekend's heavy rainfall over the next few days. Environment Agency staff are continuing their work across the country and are engaging closely with local resilience forums and local responders, with arrangements in place to scale up their response if and when that is needed. As of 4 p.m. today, there is one severe flood warning in place, 120 flood warnings and 145 flood alerts in force across England. A severe flood warning, which reflects a danger to life, was issued in the early hours of this morning and relates to the Billing Aquadrome on the River Nene in Northamptonshire, where the caravan park was safely evacuated. This is the fourth time the Aquadrome has been flooded in recent years, and I would like to thank local responders for their swift actions to protect those most at risk. The Environment Agency and local responders have also been busy protecting properties elsewhere in England, including flooding from the River Teme in Tenbury Wells, where around 40 properties have flooded. The river has now peaked, and local responders will be focusing on the lower reaches of rivers over the next few days. There has been a focus on the Calder Valley in West Yorkshire, the River Weaver in Cheshire, and the River Avon in Bath, including Chippenham and Bradford upon Avon. Further flooding is sadly likely over the next few days as water levels rise in slower flowing rivers such as the Severn and the Ouse. The Environment Agency anticipates that any impacts should be less severe than we've seen in recent days. Storm Bert also caused disruption to road and rail networks. Our transport industry has well-established plans to respond to severe weather and get affected transport networks running smoothly as quickly as possible. National highways, local highway teams and network rail staff have been working all weekend to reduce floodwater and remove fallen trees from roads and railways. Unfortunately, residual floodwater is affecting the Great Western Main Line, the Midland Main Line and other branch lines, and this continues to affect passengers' journeys. The safety of passengers, train crew and staff is always the top priority, and railway lines will be reopened as soon as it is safe for trains to run. Climate change will inevitably lead to more severe weather of the kind we've seen this weekend. As Secretary of State for the Environment, I have made it my priority to improve our flood defences and drainage systems to keep people and businesses safe. This government inherited flood defences in the worst condition on record following years of underinvestment by the previous government. Over 3,000 of our key flood defences are below an acceptable standard. That is why we are investing £2.4 billion over the next 2 years to build and maintain flood defences. We've also set up a new Floods Resilience Task Force to make sure there is better coordination between central government and the frontline agencies on the ground up and down the country. This brings together organisations including the Association of Drainage Authorities, the National Farmers Union, Local Resilience Forum and emergency responders. It is key to strengthening resilience in the face of floods, and it met for the first time in September to prepare for the autumn and for the winter. We've provided £60 million in the recent budget to help farmers affected by the unprecedented flooding earlier this year, and I'm pleased to tell the House that the bulk of these payments are already in farmers' bank accounts. We have confirmed an additional £50 million will be distributed to internal drainage boards to manage water levels to protect agriculture and the environment, and we will launch a consultation in the new year which will include a review of the existing flood funding formula to ensure challenges facing businesses and rural and coastal communities are taken into account when delivering flood protection. We aim to bring in that new approach from April 2026. I'd like to repeat, Madam Deputy Speaker, my thanks to the emergency services, local authorities and the Environment Agency for their work to keep communities safe during Storm Bert. I will continue to receive updates from the Environment Agency and their teams on the ground, and I will continue to ensure that members across the House are contacted when flooding affects their constituency.
I call Shadow Minister Victoria Atkins.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of his statement. Storm Bert has and continues to have terrible impacts across the United Kingdom. Our thoughts are with the loved ones of those who have lost their lives in recent days, as well as the people whose homes and businesses have been devastated, and all of the communities affected by flooding and this weather. I understand the distress, the anger, and frankly the exhaustion that many will be feeling today as they contemplate the process of rebuilding their homes, businesses, and communities, as my own constituency suffered terrible damage a year ago with Storm Bert. Residents need practical support quickly, and they also need some reassurance for the future. I'd like to thank the emergency services, the local authorities and the Environment Agency in their efforts to help people quickly and often in dangerous circumstances. But I would also like to thank the members of the public who have stepped in to help their neighbours and local communities in countless ways. They are the rays of kindness in what has been a dark weekend for many communities. Now, the government needs to focus on how help will be given to those who have been driven out of their homes, including the provision of decent temporary accommodation, the repair and reopening of schools, as well as the process for speeding up insurance claims so that residents can return home as quickly as possible, knowing, as we do sadly from previous storms, how important members across this House will be in helping their constituents. Will the Secretary of State commit to ensuring that his department sends a daily operational update to members across the House so that members may help their constituents assiduously? Last week, his department will have received data from the Met Office about the severity of this storm and its likely impacts. So that we can understand the urgency that the Secretary of State gave to these warnings, could he tell us, please, the discussions that he had with the Environment Agency and the Met Office before the storm hit and when, and what actions were implemented as a result of any such meetings? He has mentioned his government's flood resilience task force that was set up to improve flood preparedness. It has met once since July, and its next meeting is next year. He has just said that its duty is to prepare for the autumn and winter. Can he list precisely what the preparations are arising out of that meeting and the practical impacts on communities up and down the country? Now, regrettably, with the threat of flooding still present, and indeed, as I rose to my feet, one severe flood warning was still in place and 120 flood warnings as well, the Secretary of State descended into playing politics. And so to correct him, I will just set out these facts, and there's a question for him to answer at the end of it. The last Conservative government committed a record £5.2 billion from 2021 until 2027 to provide significantly improved flooding defences across the country. This is critical and long-standing infrastructure work. Will he confirm that the £2.4 billion he has referenced is part of that £5.2 billion or in addition to it? The Conservatives ring-fenced £100 million to help those communities threatened repeatedly by flooding, called the Frequently Flooded Allowance. Will the government confirm the continuance of this fund and its ring-fencing? When is the next assessment for this scheme? And can communities flooded through Storm Bert be included? We also set up the Natural Flood Management Fund to complement traditional bricks and mortar defences. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this will be continued? And I note that the Secretary of State has mentioned funding independent drainage boards to the tune of £50 million. Can he confirm that this funding has been cut from the £75 million promised by the Conservatives, and why? And whilst I welcome the increase of £10 million at budget for the Farming Recovery Fund that was announced by the Conservative government to support farmers for last year's wet weather, can he confirm that he will announce new money to support farmers for this winter's bad weather? And can he give comfort to the farmers watching that the Treasury will include adverse weather conditions and flooding as mitigations for their much criticised family farm tax? Finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I end by wishing every single community, whether they are the subject of those flood warnings or who are watching their weather updates with great concern, I wish everyone a safe and comfortable few days ahead.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her comments and echo her good wishes to people who have been affected by the situation. She refers to funding. Of course, I would politely remind her she was a Treasury Minister in the previous government, which underfunded our flood defences and left over 3,000 of them in an inadequate state, which is the highest level on record being inadequate. She asks about appropriate support on the front line. The Flood Resilience Task task force exists to ensure that the agencies on the front line right across the country, local authorities and other agencies responsible, were ready for this and other storms when they happen and have made sure that appropriate support is in place for individuals, families and communities that may be affected, of course including those who are most vulnerable. My honourable friend, the Minister for Water, has already held a round table with insurance providers to ensure that we are speeding up support for those people who are affected by flooding. The Environment Agency will, of course, keep members updated on a very regular basis on the circumstances in their own constituencies. And returning back to funding, we've allocated £2.4 billion over the next 2 years. That is more per annum in each of those 2 years than the previous government allocated for the current year.
Chair of the Select Committee, Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I entirely empathise with my right honourable friend about what he has inherited. We had the perfect storm of massive funding cuts to the Environment Agency, with increased pressures from flooding as a result of climate change. Notwithstanding that, the need for improvements in our flood defences is absolutely urgent and critical. How can communities like mine in Chesterfield, flooded by the River Rother and Hipper, engage with the work that he's doing so that we are able to be more prepared, and so that the community can work with the Environment Agency to bridge the funding gap that we've been told on the existing scheme on the River Hipper, and right across the country, communities like those so appallingly flooded, who my heart goes out to because of what I've seen, need to know how we can work with the government to step up the urgency to make our country more flood prepared in the future.
I thank the Chair of the Committee for his questions, and of course I sympathise with residents in his constituency who will have been affected by the recent flooding and indeed previous flooding. The government is reviewing the flood funding formula so that we can look at making it more effective. That includes looking at nature-based flood management, things like planting more trees further upstream to help the land hold more water, so less rain when it comes is flooding down downstream where it can cause more damage in more populated areas. That consultation will be involving businesses, rural communities, coastal communities, communities including his own, so that they can all feed in and we can make sure we have a flood funding formula that works for every single part of the country.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Tim Farron.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to thank the Secretary of State for advance sight of the statement. The financial cost of the devastation caused by Storm Bert will run into many, many millions, and yet it is absolutely nothing compared to the heartbreaking loss of life. My prayers are for the loved ones of those who have died and for the communities so horrifically affected. I too am grateful to the emergency services of all kinds, council workers, Environment Agency, and to the communities who have pulled together and been wonderful neighbours to their neighbours up and down this country, and indeed to the many members who have got their hands dirty serving their constituencies. My honourable friend included the member for Chippenham, who, in the absence of any trains, hired a car this morning, left Parliament to get back to her communities to be with those who've been devastated by the flooding. This storm does highlight the foolishness of the government's real terms reduction in the DEFRA budget of 1.9% by 2026, which forms a threat to flood-affected communities, at least potentially via flood management schemes, through natural flood management, through specific projects such as those in Kendal and Appleby. So would the Secretary of State clarify that he may seek to reverse those cuts? Disruption to rail services has been significant too. Less than a year after the terrifying derailment at Grange over Sands, the whole of the Furness line in my constituency is now out of action until later this week. Will ministers put extra resources into assuring that this vital line and others is upgraded and made more robust? Storm events also have an impact on our sewage networks. Research by the Save Windermere campaign estimates that storm overflows discharging untreated sewage into our lake began at 3:21 this morning and that by midday could have reached a volume of 7 million litres. So will the government speed up action to prevent egregious storm overflows like this across our country? And finally, does he understand that given the crucial role farmers play in natural flood management, his decision to cut 76% of the basic payment scheme from next year could push farmers away from such schemes altogether, and will he revisit that decision?
I'm grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman for his comments and for his question, and I share and echo his gratitude to members across the House for the work that they've carried out to support their local constituents and signpost them to appropriate support. And we will be making sure the Environment Agency continues to engage with members so they can continue carrying out that very important work. Now, the Right Honourable Gentleman will be aware of the very, very difficult financial inheritance we had from the previous government. In that context, I think the fact that we've been able to deliver an increase in funding for flooding is to be welcomed. £2.4 billion over the next 2 years means there is an increase in each of those years compared to the amount of funding provided by the previous government for the current year. He mentions as well storm overflows. Of course, it's extremely distressing to see when we have these more severe episodes of rain that more storm overflows will be discharging sewage into rivers, lakes and seas. Of course, Sir John Cunliffe is leading a wider review into the failures of governance and regulation that have led to this situation happening, and I'm sure he and his party members will be engaging with that. But in addition, we are requiring every single outflow to be monitored so we know what is going out into our rivers and can take appropriate action, including the strengthened powers provided by the Water Special Measures Bill going through the House right now.
Nick Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Storm Bert has been devastating for my constituents. In Cwmteleiri, with its disused coal tips, 160 millimetres of rain fell in just 48 hours. Across Blaenau, Gwent and Rumney, homes have been washed out, children's Christmas presents have been ruined, and families without insurance are counting the cost. Now, can I hugely welcome the 25 million in the budget for Welsh coalfield tip maintenance and safety measures. It made a big difference. Given, though, the extraordinary weather we saw on the weekend, will the Secretary of State please look again to see if further support is available for coal tips in the future?
I thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I recognise the absolute devastation he describes that homeowners, business owners will have felt to see their homes devastated by flooding. The Prime Minister contacted and spoke to the First Minister for Wales on Sunday, and he made available any support for the Welsh Government that they may need to deal with the situation. That offer stands open, and we are ready to support colleagues in Wales if and when they require that, recognising that it was parts of Wales that have been the hardest hit by Storm Bert.
Diolch,
Dyffryn Lefarydd. Plaid Cymru's thoughts are with all those across Wales affected by Storm Bert. Confirmation of a coal tip landslip in Cwmteleiri is extremely concerning and will lead to anxiety for others living near coal tips. These tips are the legacy of an industry that extracted from Wales to enrich London. Yet, the UK government has only pledged just 4% of the 600 million needed to secure them. Will the Secretary of State commit to providing the full funding required?
State.
I thank her